insinuate or preach hate towards any group, race, tribe, or person. The goal of this video is for you to look for the books, journals, magazines, or other publications referenced and study them yourself. Remember, unity has never meant uniformity. Martin Luther King Jr. This video is not for entertainment. It's not for views or for thumbs up or down. It's not a propaganda video either. It is not for popularity. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. Recall from previous parts of this series that we try to show you what they are playing with in African and saying we are all Africans and all those African appellations. We also talked about Othman Dan Fodio and what he did and who he was. We showed you that Negroes were the only ones captured and sold as slaves during the slave trade. We also showed you how and who the Fulanis and Arabs were and how they captured and sold the Negroes and why they are hell-bent on the African appellation. Remember, when they say African, everyone becomes an African, including the Negroes and those that captured and sold them. But then, when they talk about those who were foolish enough to sell their brothers and sisters, they will also be looking at the Negroes, whereas it wasn't the Negroes that did it. Now, remember this very well. It's a different thing if the Negroes were the ones who sold themselves. But now, if you looked at it very well, if you do a bit of digging and investigate, you will discover that when they say African, they are actually referring to the Negroes. Whereas, the Negroes are only a very tiny portion of what you call Africa. For example, if you looked at it, when they say African American, they don't mean the Egyptians or the Arabs. They only mean the people they captured and sold as slaves. But if you don't think very well, you will think, oh, you are all the same. That's why you see some descendants of former slaves thinking they are the same with Moroccans, Algerians, Egyptians, and all that. Again, even in sub-Saharan Africa, there are Negroes, Negroids, Arabs, Fulanis, Berbers, Tuaregs. They are not all Negroes, or not all of them were sellable. So we need to get that fact very, very clear so that we can understand why the group will be killed and another group will be happy that they were killed and still be telling you that they are their brothers. Remember, it's only a fool that can be happy that his or her brother is killed for nothing. That way you understand what we're talking about. But in this edition, we're still going to digress a bit to explain something that some people keep asking us questions about when we know that they should have seen it in some of our videos. So if you have been following some of the comments in the videos, you would have noticed that some people come with something like, we are all Africans, Africa is one, we are united and all that. You would have also noticed that they are very, very adamant with the African appellation, trying to make everyone feel the same while being treated differently. So now, remember also that when they say African, you can investigate this yourself. They are not saying the Egyptians are Africans, or the Algerians, or the Moroccans, or the Tunisians, or the modern-day Ethiopians. They are actually referring to the descendants of former slaves, the Negroes themselves. But they make it look like they are referring to everyone from Africa, which is not the case. They know who they are referring to, but they pretend to make it look like you are all Africans. So in the last series, we got a question and something that suggests or tries to suggest the Fulanis are just as equally victims as the Negroes, which is not true because they were the slave hunters and slave raiders. So the question becomes, they were also sold. How come you are saying they were the ones that sold? Now that should bring all of us to asking who actually did the capturing and who did the selling. Please remember, there is nothing like the Arab one happened before the European one. They all happened simultaneously between 1434 and 1900. Take note of this, and if you're a scholar, you can go and do your research. They happened simultaneously between 1434 and 1900. What happened was, while the ones they called transatlantic slave trade were just Negroes shipped across the Atlantic to Europe and America and the Caribbean, the ones that you call trans-Sahara slave trade were the ones that were captured and marched on foot across the desert to the Middle East. So when they tell you that there is this religion that is different from the other, and both are coming from the slave masters, it's part of their lives. So we're going to try to show you the difference between the Negroes and those that captured and sold them as slaves at that time. So let us make progress by referencing a book called The Missionary History of Sierra Leone by Reverend Henry Siddall, and it was published in 1874. We see the following account. The Fuller arrests attention by his strong Arab and occasionally Roman features, the long ringlets that hang down to his shoulders, his thoughtful eye, his measured step, and his rosary of beads generally carried in his hand. You cannot mistake him. He is a disciple of the prophet of Mecca. He is the gold merchant of the coast, and he is more than suspected of being a slave merchant too. It is important to bear in mind that the proper Fullers are not of the Negro race, nor are they the original inhabitants of the countries in which they live. Their features are European, their hair is straight and silky, and their skin of a tawny hue, inclining to copper. These proper Fullers are, however, less numerous than the black Fullers, who have sprung from the intermarriages of the tawny race with the Negroes. So we believe that this should have addressed any doubts you have about who the Fulanis are and who the Negroes are. However, let us also look at another source before we move forward. Let us reference another book called The Fullers of Central Africa and the African Slave Trade by W.B. Hodgson, and published 1843. We see the following. The Fullers are not Negroes. They differ essentially from the Negro race in all the characteristics which are marked by physical anthropology. They may be said to occupy the intermediate space betwixt the Arab and the Negro. All travelers concur in representing them as a distinct race, in moral as in physical traits. To their color, the various stamps of bronze, copper, reddish, and sometimes white has been applied. They concur also in the report that the Fullers of every region represent themselves to be white men and proudly assert their superiority to the black tribes among whom they live. Mungo Park's description of them does not vary much from that of all subsequent travelers, and which is substantially repeated in Sean and Crowder's Journal of the Niger Expedition made in 1841 in the British government steamer the Albert. So we hope this clarifies as well. We are still going to move forward to show you exactly what we're talking about. Let us also reference Stanford's Compendium of Geography and Travel, Africa, by the late Kit Johnston, 3rd edition, and it was published in 1884. We see the following. In all these respects, they differ essentially from the four next systems, the Fuller, Pure Negro, Bantu, and Hottentot, which, as far as can be ascertained, are indigenous, are all four totally distinct from each other, and belong not to the inflecting but to the agglutinating forms of speech. So it goes further down to say the Fuller and Noba groups. Their very name of Pulo, which is written in the most diverse ways as Pul, Peol, Folby, Fuller, Fuller, Felata, and the like, and which means yellow or brown, serves at once to distinguish them from the surrounding Negro races. This is very clear, and it goes further down to say Sokoto, the principal of the Felata states, midway between the Niger and Borno. That was where Sultan Bello was from, and that is where Othman Dan Fodio was from as well. So you can see that they can't be Negroes. Also, if you look at the footnote where it said Negro races with one on top, you see that one, it says they are even called Abate, i.e. white men by the Jukus, who dwell southwest of Borno. Kole African Polygatha, page 21. So you can reference the materials and see things for yourself. Now, if you want to actually investigate what is going on, just look at what they are doing in sub-Saharan Africa today. How many communities are being desolated? Today, we are not talking of 20 20 or 30 years ago. We are talking of today, as in 2018. And don't expect to hear this in BBC or VOA, because like we are telling you, these are their foot soldiers. That's the same group doing the same thing they have been doing. So let us move forward. If we reference A History of Colonization on the Western Coast of Africa by Archibald Alexander, published 1846, we see the following. Of all the nations of Central Africa described by Captain Clapperton, the Felatas, that's the Fulanis, are esteemed the most remarkable. The publication of his first journey to Sudan represented these people as inhabiting the country of the Negroes, but differing from them essentially in physical character. They have straight hair, noses moderately elevated, the parietal bones not so compressed as those of the Negro, nor is their forehead so much arched. The color of their skin is a light bronze, like that of the Wadringans or Melano-Gotelians, and by this characteristic alone can they be classified in the Ethiopian variety of the human species. The Felatas are a warlike race of shepherds and have within a short period subjugated an extensive portion of Sudan. The lamented Major Lang, who arrived at Timbuktu, assures us that they were then in possession of that far-famed city. It was an order from the Felata governor, that's the Fulani governor, which compelled him to leave Timbuktu, and to his instigation or connivance is his death probably to be attributed. Mongo Park was killed by a party of these people while descending the Kora, that's the Niger. They may be supposed to occupy the banks of the unknown river from its rise to its termination. Now begin to ask yourself, if Mongo Park was killed by the Fulanis and the British know, the Scottish know where Mongo Park is from, and they hide it, don't you think there is something they are benefiting from using the Fulanis more than talking about the Mongo Park that they killed? Now remember, the reason they killed Mongo Park was he provided a positive information about the Negroes, which they didn't like. If you doubt what we're saying, all you need to do, pick up these books and study them yourself. That's all you need to do. Just study them yourself. Pay very close attention to every detail. But let us move forward. The Felatas are so denominated by the Negroes. So now, if they were Negroes, why would the Negroes be denominating them? But the name by which they call themselves is Felan, which might be more correctly reading Fulan, according to the sound of the syllables. The origin of the term Felata is not known, but as they are anthropoclepts, like the Tuaregs, and still Negroes to make slaves of them, it is probably an appellation of reproach, like that of Sego, given to these later. They are known on the Senegal and Gambia as Fulas and Peos. Mongo Park describes them under the first denomination and Mmolian under the second. The Felatas extend from the Atlantic to the confines of Darfur and speak everywhere the same language. So if you're still in doubt, the best thing to do is to study the materials, then look at what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa today. That's all you need to do. But let us still move forward. So let us further see why they are so hell-bent on the African appellation by referencing a book called The African Slave Trade and Its Remedy, and it was by Thomas Fowell Buxton and published in 1840. And there we see the following. Laird ascended the Niger and its tributary the Shadda in 1832 and was an eyewitness of the cruelties consequent on the slave trade. While in the river, near to the confluence of the two streams, he says, speaking of the incursion of the Felatas, that's the Fulanis, scarcely a night passed, but we heard the screams of some unfortunate beings that were carried off into slavery by these villainous depredators. The inhabitants of the towns in the route of the Felatas fled across the river on the approach of the enemy. A few days after the arrival of the fugitives, a column of smoke rising in the air about 5 miles above the confluence marked the advance of the Felatas. And in 2 days afterwards, the whole of the town, including Adakuda and 5 or 6 others, were in a blaze. The shrieks of the unfortunate wretches that had not escaped, answered by the loud wailings and lamentations of their friends and relations encamped on the opposite bank of the river, at seeing them carried off into slavery, and their habitations destroyed, produced a scene which, though common enough in the country, had seldom, if ever before, been witnessed by European eyes, and showed to me in a more striking light than I had hitherto beheld it, the horrors attendant upon slavery. So this is where people are ignorant. They don't know what is going on. If you want to really understand what the slave trade was like, read these old materials, the eyewitness accounts. All the people could do at that time was to escape. They set up vigilante to monitor when the Fulanis were coming. They were then Arabs. They were seen as white people. So when the alarm is raised, people will escape. Those who could not escape are then captured. Let us then see what happens after the raid, because they destroyed the entire city completely, burned the houses down, so only those that escaped survived. Let's see what they do by referencing travels in the interior districts of Africa performed under the direction and patronage of the African Association in the years 1795, 1796 and 1797 by Mungo Park, Sojourn, and it was published in 1799. We see the following. When their country has been desolated, and their ruined towns and villages deserted by the enemy, such of the inhabitants as have escaped the sword and the chain generally return, though with cautious steps, to the place of their nativity. For it seems to be the universal wish of mankind to spend the evening of their days where they passed their infancy. The poor Negro feels this desire in its full force. To him, no water is sweet but what is drawn from his own well, and no tree has so cool and pleasant a shade as the taba tree of his native village. When war compels him to abandon the delightful spot in which he first drew his breath, and seek for safety in some other kingdom, his time is spent in talking about the country of his ancestors, and no sooner is peace restored than he turns his back upon the land of strangers, rebuilds with haste his fallen walls, and exults to see the smoke ascend from his native village. So you see how the Negroes lived at that time. So we challenge you that claims that Fulanis were Negroes or were sold, to show us where they were sold and how they could have lived like this, or at which point any Fulani village or community was raided by the Negroes and to capture them. Remember, the Negroes did not have firearms. If you check today, we challenge you to go and look at what is happening in middle belt of Nigeria, where the Fulanis are currently doing the same thing they were doing then. We challenge you to go and look at what they do. They come and use the established army force. The army came from the original Fulani slave raiding group. They would disarm the vigilante. Make sure you don't have any weapons to protect yourself with, because the government backs them up anyway, with, of course, the slave masters backing as well. They supply the weapons. So when they are sure that the communities do not have any weapons to protect themselves, they come and wipe off everybody, knowing that you can't retaliate. There is nothing you can do. And then, of course, the BBC, the VOA, Al Jazeera, and all the slave masters media outlets will tell you it's communal clashes. If you doubt what we are saying, all we ask you to do is investigate. That's all you need to do. You don't need to do anything. All you need to do is find out. That's all. Let us also reference a book called The White Man in Nigeria by George Douglas Hazelden, and it was published 1904. We see the following: that every woman about to become a mother went and hid in the bush like a wild beast until the baby was old enough not to be a fatal encumbrance in case of a hasty flight. Then again, the rumor that the Fulani were coming emptied great villages and scattered the people over the face of the earth. Then again, the old and the whatever, but our interest is for you to see how the Negroes lived in fear of the Fulani at that time. And then you are turning to tell us that they are the same Africans and they are the same Negroes. They are not. So all the essence of this whole narrative is for you to go and look for the materials and then be able to read what they are doing in sub-Saharan Africa today. because they are the slave master foot soldiers. There is no way the Negroes could have sold themselves. Sorry. So here again we know that about 100 years ago, the rough and ready intertribal man catching was stopped by the founding of the Fulani dynasty by Othman Fodio, the first Fulani Sultan, which has lasted until now, organizing government, justice and revenue, and protecting the people from the outside raiders of the coast, who found a happy hunting ground there for black ivory. For 100 years, this dynasty has been all-powerful. Even the Londoner heard with interest from time to time of the alleged 20,000 breast-plated cavalrymen of Sokoto and of the chain armor of Kano. For 100 years, all caravans have paid heavy toll on passing in and out of Hausa land, and for 100 years, even white men have paid subsidies to native chiefs for the right not to have their stores unreasonably plundered or their careers caught for slaves too often. So that's who the Fulanis were. If you notice, if you doubt what we're telling you here, go to Nigeria, find out what they understand as tax is the same thing they do with tributes and slaves. So they take taxes just for themselves, spend it, send their children abroad while the masses are still suffering. That's what they understand as leadership. We are going to show you where the slave masters recorded it themselves as well. Now, this is how relieved people were with the coming of the white men themselves, because they were better than the Fulanis, even though both were barbaric. But what happened was that at that time, the Europeans had stopped slave raiding, so they needed to stop the Arabs, which the Fulanis were at that time. Remember, there is nothing like the Arab slave trade happened before this one. They all happened simultaneously. But these guys were catching the slaves, not knowing that the slave masters, the Europeans, had wanted to stop theirs, because the communication wasn't as you say it today. There was no YouTube or radio and all that to follow. The books were there anyway. So now, this is what happened between somebody that knew what was happening prior to Europeans coming. And he says, Musa knew a lot about slavery. One day, when he overheard one of the punka boys who had been judiciously whipped for stealing a tin of lard out of the storeroom, holding forth to the other household servants on the cruelty of the white man in general and the hardships of government house service in particular, he walked into the group and, catching the fat youth by the ear, said, "You be one big fool. You, if the white man no come, you be slave and carry brick for the Fulani all day. You know, sabi that? You be one big fool." So you see how it is. The white man's coming was a relief. But now that the white man is gone, the Fulanis are back at their game. That's all they understand. If you doubt what we're telling you, all you need to do is to go to the sub-Saharan African countries and look for what they have achieved in the so-called independence. Remember, the independence was not independence. They just handed them back to the Fulanis. That's what they did. So you need to do two things: find out who and who were Negroes, and find out who and who are ruling and what criteria they used to make those rulers you see there. Remember, gun, bombs, bullets, armored cars, APCs, they do not rot, they do not expire. But the slave master needs somebody who should be or will be using them so that they can buy more. And the Fulanis fit that bill. That's why you see all of them dancing around the Sultan of Sokoto, who was the Sultan of the Fulani at that time, because they know where the fool lives. If you doubt what we are saying, all we ask you to do is investigate. That's all you need to do. Let us also reference a tropical dependency, an outline of the ancient history of the Western Sudan, with an account of the modern settlement of northern Nigeria by Flora L. Shaw, Lady Lugard, published 1905. We see the following. It was evident that if the policy of ruling through the Fulani was to be maintained, the first duty of the British administration was to provide for the peaceable collection of the taxes, and since the conquered emirs had been deprived of the power to raise troops or police in their territories, it was necessary that the British force should even be applied in case of need to compel payment. So you see how it is. They are all interested in taxes and pillaging the populace. So that's the same thing. That's what the Fulani is doing for them there. That's why they are the foot soldiers of the slave masters. If you do a little research, you will find out what we're telling you. The only reason they have them there is because they feel they look closer to the Negroes than the Europeans. So when they hide within the Negroes, they can be doing whatever they are doing. Just ask yourself, how much have they achieved as a so-called independent nation in places like Nigeria and all of sub-Saharan Africa? Ask yourself why those who worked in plantations, fed the slave masters, can no longer farm. That's because they are not even allowed to farm. You had the Fulani president of Nigeria with the US president talking about agricultural produce exported to Nigeria. That's what they've been doing. We're still going to show you how they do it. It's not a new thing, but do some investigation, do some research yourself. So let us reference Journal of an Expedition up the Niger and Chada rivers undertaken by MacGregor Laird, Esquire, in connection with the British government in 1854 by the Reverend Samuel Crowder, with map and appendix, and it was published in 1855. We see the following. Upon landing, we saw recent traces of the Filatas, that's the Fulanese. Only last night, a horseman and 6 foot soldiers were sent to see if the inhabitants of Yimaha could be easily taken away. The spies, finding the town deserted, went through it, even to the water edge, where they stopped some time. Quite recent traces of their horses being visible. One can better feel than express in words the distressed state of these poor people, who are continually harassed and haunted by the Filatas, that's the Fulanese, the greatest pest of this part of the country. They will not walk themselves, and those who will, they disturb and seek to enslave, eating up all the same time the fruits of their industry. So you see how it was for the Negroes at that time and the Fulanese. That's what they're doing till today. So you don't think, oh, anybody is making anything up. If you think we have said anything that is not correct, all we challenge you to do is, just as we have provided books with the accounts showing that what they are doing today in sub-Saharan Africa is historical, we want you to do the same. Show us a book that shows otherwise. We know why they are saying, oh, African. They are trying to tar everyone with the same brush, bring all of us into and under one umbrella, and of course, be enslaving us. Remember, the so-called Hebrew Israelites, they lack knowledge of history. That is why they are buying into the narrative of the slave master, wherever the book came from. There is no way the Most High can write a book, and he couldn't have written it and given it to someone else to bring to you in a foreign language. The Most High speaks all the languages, and there is no way his book could have been in one language or the other. The same way he was able to write in Arabic, write in ancient Hebrew, write in ancient Greek, he should have been able to write in any Negro language, to show you that the languages of the Negroes are different and totally unrelated to the languages of the so-called books written by whoever. Let us reference one material. Let us reference Impressions of Western Africa with remarks on the diseases of the climate and a report on the peculiarities of trade up the rivers in the Bight of Biafra by Thomas J. Hutchinson, Esquire, and it was published in 1858. We see the following. Different nations of them speak different languages, and Captain Adams has justly remarked that the Tower of Babel might have been built on the western shores of Africa, as a different language is spoken at every 10 or 12 miles, though these different languages are generally understood by the natives along the coast. So our interest here is that you see that there is numerous languages of the Negroes, which is different from what the Fulanese and Tuaregs and other non-Negroes speak. So the reason they were able to capture the Negroes was because the languages differed. So because the languages were different, they were smart to make sure that in their slave ships, people with different languages were placed together. Those so-called Elmina Castle, Cape Coast Castle, Goree Castle were slave-holding facilities. That is where they sought them into different languages so that they don't overpower the ship. They don't come together to fight the ship. If you go to places like sub-Saharan Africa today, that's the same thing the slave masters, foot soldiers are doing. So in order to understand how the slave masters and their foot soldiers worked together, let us reference the dual mandate in British tropical Africa by the Right Honorable Sir F.D. Lugard, and it was published in 1922. We see the following. The Fulani of northern Nigeria are, as I have said, more capable of rule than the indigenous races, but in proportion as we consider them an alien race, we are denying self-government to the people over whom they rule and supporting an alien caste, albeit closer and more akin to the native races than a European can be. Your takeaway here is albeit closer and more akin to the native races than a European can be. Now, your challenge should be to go and find out what he is insinuating or what he is saying by saying they are closer than an European can be. Remember, the slave masters, presidents and rulers today, even the one that is to be born tomorrow, has already been told who the Negroes and the fools they use in sub-Saharan Africa are. That's why you see these things. If you check very well, you see that almost all the leaders in Europe, especially the British, the French, Italy, and all those European countries that are more interested in conquest and subjugating other nations, would have read this book. But if you check, you will see that the ones in sub-Saharan Africa have not even read it, including professors. They don't even understand what they read anyway, and you will see that even the so-called descendants of former slaves in the United States that agree to the appellation of African American, without considering their siblings, their brothers and sisters sold to the Caribbeans, the Brazilians, to Middle East, to Europe, that built those places as well. They just carved out a small, tiny slave enclave for themselves and call themselves African American. So what do you call the people that